All right, so we have a really exciting program and a lot of things to cover, so we're going to go ahead and get started. I know it's not quite the time for Hampshire things to start, but that's okay. People can continue to walk in while we do the introduction. So welcome, Hampshire students, staff, and faculty, our 5 college colleagues, alums, community, and friends. Thank you for participating in the 23rd annual Eqbal Ahmad Lecture, a symposium on the state we are in, building an intersectional movement for reproductive justice. I offer a special welcome to Julie Diamond, Eqbal's wife, and Dora Ahmad, his daughter. I also greet attendees from around the world who have been able to join us because of the hybrid format we adopted this year. And I eagerly welcome all of the members of our community and those from around the 5 colleges in the Valley who have come to join us today. I am grateful to the Eqbal Ahmad Committee, including Uzma Aslam Khan, Amy Jordan, and Ruz Belinda Cardenas. Thank you to Senior Vice President Sheila Lloyd and Beth Madison of the Division of Justice, Equity, and Anti-Racism for creating an inspiring and timely program for Engage, culminating in this lecture today. Kathy Hughes devoted a substantial time to logistics and contracts for this event, and I am grateful. Finally, thanks to Rayanne Wentworth-Cadu, John Bruner, and Taylor Ortiz for their extensive and generous technical assistance setting up this webinar. This endowed lecture honors the teaching, scholarship, and activism of the late Eqbal Ahmad, a longtime Hampshire College professor. Professor Ahmad's faculty colleagues, former students, family, and friends from around the world joined together to make this lecture series a continuing celebration of his life and his work. It's an enduring legacy that honors the principles of the man for whom it is named, inspires us to reflect on the teacher's impact, and underscores the opportunity and obligation every educator has to make a difference for students, to infuse scholarship with activism, and to pursue justice. This lectureship brings to Hampshire College and our community distinguished scholars, political figures, activists, and artists engaged with questions of social movements and social justice in both the United States and the post-colonial worlds in which Eqbal was engaged. Today's program exemplifies that goal. As a witness to global conflict, Eqbal devoted his life's work to writing, teaching, and above all else, working for change. He was a participant in and witness to some of the most harrowing times and political struggles of the 20th century, the partition of India and Pakistan and its legacies, the Algerian Revolution, the Vietnam War, Middle East conflict, and the First Gulf War. His experience, his commitment to activism, his scholarship, all represent Hampshire College at its best. Part of this legacy is the astounding list of speakers that have visited Hampshire College to lead the Eqbal Ahmad Symposium, like Arundhati Roy, Noam Chomsky, Judith Butler, Howard Zinn, Michelle Alexander, Edward Said, and Kimberly Crenshaw, who it's illegal to teach in Florida. Today, Michele Goodwin and Dorothy Roberts, along with our moderators, Loretta Ross and Jallicia Jolly, join this lineage. Margaret?
My glasses are fogged because of my mask. So when I have offered brief remarks about Eqbal to introduce previous lectures, I've tried to connect his concerns to the theme of the day, which usually is very easy. Last year's symposium, for example, addressed race, empire, and state-sanctioned violence, issues that in many ways defined his life. In other years, as Ed said, many of the speakers were his friends. It was, though perhaps not surprisingly hard, to make a connection to this year's theme, not because Eqbal, as far as I know, ever took up the issue of abortion rights or reproductive justice, but because in the face of oppression and injustice, particularly racist and colonial injustice, he unflinchingly urged us to activism. I remember a time in the 90s when Nigerian Nobel laureate Wole Soyinka, poet, essayist, playwright, political activist, spoke at Hampshire. Soyinka described what was happening in Nigeria at that moment when environmental activists organized against Shell Oil's operations in the Niger Delta. Shell worked with the Nigerian military to repress their growing movement. The crackdown culminated in the torture and execution of acclaimed writer and environmentalist Ken Saro-Wiwa and 8 other leaders known as the Ogoni Nine. Upon hearing this, Eqbal rose in the audience, I believe it was in this auditorium, and said, "Students, faculty, friends, we must do something." Immediately, the Hampshire College Committee for the Ogoni People formed to create public awareness of what was happening, mostly by holding demonstrations at Shell gas stations throughout the valley, which in subsequent months became a frequent sight. Surely, if Eqbal were alive today, he would applaud this culminating event of a day oriented toward activism around reproductive justice, since it is clear that in the face of the deprivations against women and gender nonconforming people, trans people, the criminalization of abortion, the attacks on bodily autonomy or sovereignty, as we learned to think of it this morning, that is the desperate state that we are in. Eqbal would have said, students, colleagues, friends, we must all do something. To help us then think through this moment, to understand the stakes and determine what is to be done, we are honored to have today 4 women very much in Eqbal's tradition, speaking, writing, and acting fearlessly and with tremendous insight, deconstructing the rhetorics of power and standing with those who suffer and resist oppression. Today's event will be conversational style with Jallicia Jolly moderating and posing questions, and Michele Goodwin, Dorothy Roberts, and Loretta Ross responding to the questions and to one another, with Loretta also posing some questions of her own that she planned for our visitors. So first I'm going to introduce Jallicia and Loretta, and they will take it from there. This is an alert to students. Jallicia Jolly has joined the faculty at Amherst College as assistant professor of American Studies and Black Studies. She's on sabbatical this year, but will again teach her course next year, Black Women and Reproductive Justice in the African Diaspora, a course that addresses the historical and contemporary experiences of Afro-diasporic women and girls in the struggle for embodied freedom, autonomy, and reproductive justice, drawing on examples from throughout the diaspora, from Africa, the US, the Caribbean, and Latin America. Her first book manuscript, Ill Erotics, Black Caribbean Women and Self-Making in the Time of HIV/AIDS, is forthcoming from the University of California Press. It's an ethnography and oral history of reproductive justice organizing by young Black Jamaican women living with HIV that chronicles how they built empowerment, self-care around disability, class oppression, severe impoverishment, and lack of access to health care. Dr. Jolly is a public scholar who writes for the popular press, from the Washington Post, and this is impressive, to USA Today, Ms. Magazine, the HuffPost, Rewire, BLP 100, and others, as well as working within racial justice and reproductive health equity organizations. Oh, and did I mention she's also a poet? She ends her faculty page at Amherst with the following commitment: I am determined with all my heart to keep generating teaching, research, scholarship, and community-based work that will enhance our collective well-being and create new legacies beyond inequality and violence. Welcome to Hampshire, Jallicia, and we hope this is only the first time. At Hampshire, Loretta Ross hardly needs an introduction. And now, an even broader world will know her, as yesterday she was awarded a MacArthur Fellowship. We are honored that this is her first public presentation since she was recognized as the genius we know her to be. Loretta has frequently spoken through her long connection to CLIP, now Collective Power for Reproductive Justice. She was actually our graduation speaker here last year. She taught here for one glorious year in 2016 before moving to Smith, and I want to again underline and alert to students so that they know, you know, about the course she teaches: white supremacy, human rights, and calling in the calling out culture. She's written 3 books about the Say what? Co-written, okay, fine. She has written 3 books about co-written 3 books about reproductive rights and justice, including one co-edited with Marlene Freed. They're available in the back, and we're eagerly awaiting her calling in the calling out culture. I will only mention one of the highlights of her long life dedicated to social activism. You may know she directed the Sister Song Women of Color Reproductive Justice Collective from 2005 to 2012. She's been deeply involved in anti-Klan work. But perhaps most notably for our topic today, in 1994, she was one of 12 Black women who, on the eve of the UN Conference on Population and Development in Cairo, conceptualized the framework of reproductive justice, which you notice how it just enters naturally, as though it's always been there, but it hasn't, to fight the isolation of abortion rights from a broader conception of reproductive freedom, including not only the right not to have children, but the right to have children and to raise them in safety, health, and dignity. Reproductive justice became an expansive and expanding organizing framework for women of color in particular that has challenged the pro-choice, pro-life binary in its popularity and its radicalism. Now, this was all before Loretta retired in 2016 to the quiet life of academia, which in her case has been an unquiet life of constant speaking and writing and agitating. And most recently, she is starting a new 5-college program, the first in the country, an undergraduate major, re-envisioning human rights, democracy, and the liberal arts. So please stay tuned. For all of this, we are grateful to you, Loretta, and honored to have you present today. I hand over the floor. Thank you.
You first.
Okay, great. Welcome, everyone. It is an absolute honor and pleasure to be here and to be in the midst of such brilliant, trailblazing, and visionary Black women. And a MacArthur Junior's Fellow. Just saying. It is an honor to also introduce Professor Dorothy Roberts. So I first came across Dr. Roberts' work as a sophomore at Williams College in my Africana Studies and Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies class. Shout outs to the professors in those. I was navigating the crossroads between my Afro-diasporic communities of Brooklyn and the elitist landscapes of Williamstown. The works of Black and transnational feminist visionaries, scholars, educators, and practitioners held my hand and my heart as I found my footing in the grounding in elite New England and its bastion of privilege and power. Dorothy Roberts' trenchant critiques of the institutional consequences of colonialism and slavery, her bold indictment of systems of violence masquerading as care, and the ritualistic denigration of Black mothers through policing of their bodies, pregnancies, and parenting was everything I needed. Dorothy's words were bold, direct, and deliberate, and showed me as a young Black woman and my peers that we could do this work, and truth matters. So I am so jolly to introduce Professor Roberts.
All right.
Dorothy Roberts is an acclaimed scholar of race, gender, and the law. Joined the University of UPenn, University of Pennsylvania, as its 14th Penn Integrates Knowledge Professor, with joint appointments in the Department of Africana Studies and Sociology, and the law school where she holds the inaugural Raymond Pace and Sadie Tanner Mussel Alexander Chair. She is also the founding director of the Penn Program on Race, Science, Society, and the Center for Africana Studies. Her path-breaking work in law and public policy focuses on urgent social justice issues in policing, family regulation, science, medicine, and bioethics. Her major book includes Fatal Invention: How Science, Politics, and Big Business Recreate Race in the 21st Century, Shattered Bonds, The Color of Child Welfare, and Killing the Black Body, which many of you know about.
Yeah,
and which,
KBB.
yes, and which is assigned in my Black Women Reproductive Justice class. Shout out to the students who took that. Hi, Eva. And she is the author of more than 100 scholarly articles and book chapters, as well as co-editor of 6 books on such topics as constitutional law and women in the law. Her work has been supported by the American Council of Learned Societies, National Science Foundation, Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, Harvard Program on Ethics and the Professions, and Stanford Center for the Comparative Studies in Race and Ethnicity. Recent recognitions of her scholarship and public service include 2019 Rutgers University Newark Honorary Doctors of Laws degree, 2017 election to the National Academy of Medicine, 2016 Society of Family Planning Life Achievement Awards, and more. Welcome to the virtual hybrid stage, Dr. Roberts.
We know that wonderful things are being said right now, but we can't hear them.
You can't hear
If
her?
we can make sure that Loretta and Jallicia
You can't hear us?
not muted. Now we can. I can hear that now.
Okay,
We
well, we'll
lost you
speak
for
as
about
loudly
3
as
minutes.
possible. Actually, I'm pretty good at shouting, so let me know when I start bursting your eardrums. It is my joy, my honor, and my pleasure to read the biography of Michele Goodwin. I was in my hospital bed when Margaret called me and wrote me and asked me, would you mind moderating this program? I said, if I've got to come there with an IV hooked up, I'm gonna be there. Right? Because I can't think of any greater honor to be here with Michele and Dorothy, 2 icons in the movement. Y'all write the theory that we activists try to practice, and so I really, really appreciate y'all. Now, Professor Michele Bratcher Goodwin will be a visiting professor at Georgetown Law in the fall of 2022. I assume that's taking place now, right? Okay. She's the Chancellor's Professor at the University of California, Irvine, and founding director of the Center for Biotechnology and Global Health Policy. She is the recipient of the 2021 Distinguished Senior Faculty Award for Research, the highest honor bestowed by the University of California. She's also the first law professor at the University of California, Irvine, to receive this award. Go you, girl. All right. She is an elected member of the American Law Institute, as well as an elected fellow of the American Bar Foundation and the Hastings Center, which is the organization that deals with ethics. Thank you. Thank you. I've heard of the Hastings Center. She's an American Law Institute advisor for the restatement, third of torts remedies. Now, that's something us non-lawyers don't even know what the hell you're talking about, but that's all right. You know, Professor Goodwin's constitutional law scholarship appears in the Harvard Law Review, California Law Review, Chicago Law Review, Cornell Law Review. Can they say anything but Law Review? Michigan Law Review, New York University Law Review. Okay, we got it, okay? This dossier addresses legal questions related to freedom of speech, religious exercise, equal protection, due process, race and sex discrimination, reproductive rights, slavery, and LGBTQ equality. Her scholarship has been referenced by national media, legislators, and civil society organizations. So why don't we shut up and start this conversation? Thank y'all.
All right, let's dive in. Can you hear me? Wonderful. So we know that Black women and girls' reproduction has long been a wealth-building strategy, and their sexual subordination and forced pregnancies built a nation on their backs and wombs. And even in the face of this dynamic terrorization, captivity, and bondage, they resisted, they mobilized, they spoke on behalf and critiqued, made calls for meaningful recognition of their reproductive dignity and bodies. From Sojourner Truth's speech exposing the impact of slavery on Black women's dignity and autonomy, to Harriet Jacobs' efforts to avoid sexual assault and rape of her captor, and to even later during the Civil Rights Movement, where we can think of Fannie Lou Hamer's efforts to make challenges against her medical mistreatment and her coerced sterilization when she went in to get medical treatment and was sterilized when under amnesia. So when we think about these radical legacies we're inheriting, one of the first question that we can dive into is, what do they mean for our contemporary efforts, for contemporary struggles for reproductive justice? From the streets to the courtrooms, from our communities to the medical institutions, what do they mean in our contemporary moment? And we can pass the virtual hybrid mic to...
Don't even ask me, so I'm here for them. Dorothy, you want to start us off?
Sure.
We need more volume on Dorothy, because I think we
Yeah.
can barely hear her. Who's ever doing
Okay. I have my laptop volume
got
up
that's
as high as
better.
I
it
can
goes.
hear you well. I think it might be
Yep,
there,
we can hear now.
Dorothy.
Yeah.
We can hear well now.
Is that okay? Okay, good. So first of all, it's just a thrill, a total thrill to be among you beautiful, brilliant geniuses, especially Loretta Ross celebrating her award. I just have been on cloud nine since yesterday when I read the announcement. And it's just so cool because Loretta has been out there fighting for reproductive justice for so long. And I see this as an award for her, but for all of us who are committed to reproductive justice, because it's a recognition of our struggle. And I'm just so happy that I can be part of this first public panel that she's on. And then Jallicia, so good to engage with you, and congratulations on your position and all that you're doing as well. And it's always good to be with my longtime friend and colleague, Michele Goodwin, as well. So this is just a happy, thrilling moment. And I'm glad that you began with that reminder, Jallicia, of Black women's resistance from the moment that our reproductive labor was captured by white enslavers, and the work of Harriet Tubman, Sojourner Truth, the theorizing that they had about the intersection, right, of gender and race, white supremacy and patriarchy. It's almost unbelievable that even under those conditions, that Black women could resist and have these brilliant thoughts about how to resist and the nature of oppression. And I say unbelievable, not because I don't think we're capable of it, but because of the kinds of conditions that they were under, just the most brutal degradation, both physical but ideological as well. And Harriet, I just want to also say Harriet Jacobs, who fought the sexual assaults of her enslaver, but also helped to get her children out of bondage. So one of the aspects, I think, of the resistance of Black women has been to advocate for their freedom and also the freedom of their children. And this is, I think, reflected in the way in which reproductive justice has always highlighted not only the human right not to have a child, but also the human right to have a child and to parent a child in a safe, healthy, supportive community that values our children. So I think I'll just mention two things that come to mind about why it's so important to know about these legacies and to keep them at the forefront of our organizing. I've been thinking recently about the importance of history and exactly what history means for abolitionist work. Because abolitionists often look at the roots of white supremacy today and patriarchy today and racial capitalism today back in the enslavement of Black people and settler colonialism, genocide of indigenous people as well. And we're living at a time where there are legislative efforts to keep children from learning about history, to keep even college professors from teaching about it, to keep it out of the textbooks, to ban books that discuss history. And there's also, I think, a view that, well, slavery is over, why even talk about it now? And even the idea that what's wrong with Black people, that they can't get over slavery. I've literally heard that in response to some talks that I've given. And so it's not so much that we just dwell on history and see it as something that happened in the past, and therefore we should keep the memory of it because it's part of our past. The history is important because it gives us lessons on how we got to where we are today. I just finished writing something about this and thought about thinking of it not so much as past history, but as a whole trajectory that laid the foundations for the kind of oppression that we still see today, and that we can trace from the time that our ancestors resisted to today. And then the other is the lessons that we can learn about how to engage in resistance and the knowledge that we can resist. You know, if Harriet Jacobs could resist, if Sojourner Truth could resist under the conditions they were living under, we can too. And we can learn about this. I think about this a lot recently with my work on abolishing the family policing system, because so many people say, well, we can't possibly abolish this system because what would we rely on to protect children and keep them safe? Just yesterday, I had a talk with somebody who was reading my book, Torn Apart, and he said to me, I don't think America's ready for what you wrote and you think we're going to do in the book. And I said, well, if we take that position, we're not going to change anything. Part of why we can have hope that we can make changes that we know of Black women and others who have made change. And we know that they have been able to keep children safe, even under more brutal, violent conditions that we're living under today. So for all those reasons, those are just some of the reasons. I know there are more, and I know that Michele is has many more to discuss as well. But those are just some of the reasons I think that learning about and keeping in our minds and in our strategizing and in our hopes, these legacies are important.
So, Dorothy, I pick up on from there with regard to the hopes, and I'm really moved by being with you. Congratulations, Loretta. I think Dorothy has said it so well that in you receiving this tremendous recognition, what it does is first it's path breaking for them to recognize that, and all ships are lifted by that. It gives a different level of recognition of that long arc, that journey that we're still on, and it's so beautiful that it's embodied in you receiving that award. So congratulations. And Jallicia, thank you so much for helping to guide the conversation today. So as you began with laying the foundation for this, I couldn't help but think about mourning and the kind of mourning that we still owe our foremothers that we just simply haven't done. I say sometimes because I think we don't pause on Black women's experiences, but it has really struck me, the night before the slave auction, what story must it be that a mother tells her child? She'll never see that child again. There's no train, no plane, no anything, no Nikes. We're talking about the 1600s, 1700s, 1800s. Her child will be taken away from her. And the journey is not just the separation, the torn apart, but it is also living in a country that tells that child, you are no more than a field animal by law. You have no human status. You are the status of a piglet, a sheep, a donkey, a mule in the field. And it is something that's instantiated in state law. In federal law, if you run away, someone can come and track you down and actually get payment for bringing you back to such a horrific system. And so, what message must a Black woman tell her child, generation after generation, day after day, to keep that child whole against a system that will tell that child, by law, you have no status worth us paying any attention to? And that if anyone should try to harm you who is white, that person will never suffer a consequence for it. And we see that in cases, right? We see it in cases where Black women have fought back. And the verdict being, I'm thinking of State v. Mann, and the court saying, oh, we wish we could do something about this when you shot her, but sorry, she just has to suffer the consequences of being shot because she was trying to resist. And so with that, then I think about Sojourner Truth. And as she gave that speech, Ain't I a Woman? And so many people think about it in context of chivalry, but forget that at the beginning of the speech, she says, and I bore 13 children and saw nearly each one snatched from my arms, and nobody heard my cry but God. Ain't I a woman? And yes, then I think about the resistance of a Sally Hemings, that kind of coercion, at least let my children be free, as you raped me starting at 13, 14 years old, Thomas Jefferson. Margaret Garner, whose story is fascinating, in the depths of winter, saying, I will be free, and walking across a frozen river with her children and saying, I have that hunger of freedom so in me that we will walk in the dead of winter across a frozen Cincinnati River to get to the other side. And then, of course, captured by Toni Morrison in Beloved, the tragedy of her attempting to kill herself and her children. And the fascinating question in the United States, because it was a case heard all around the world and all across the country, was that to convict her of murder would mean that she is human and her kids are human. But if she's not convicted of murder, we get to just keep her as property, her kids as property, and the system just goes on. And we know the outcome. She's not convicted of murder. And so when we sort of think about these stories in Harriet Jacobs of resistance incidents in the life of a slave girl, which also intersects something else. Often these stories are told about, white men and their punishments and brutalities against Black women and girls. But what's fascinating about her story is how she was owned by a woman. Her mother was owned by a woman. She was actually bequeathed to a 5-year-old along with a dresser. And it was that 5-year-old's father who was so, his prurience, targeting her as a little girl. All of these interconnecting systems. And so it is amazing that we are where we are today. And this makes me think about perhaps a long arc, which is to think about the Bruce Beach story, which is interesting. There's a place in California called Manhattan Beach, very swanky, expensive beach, owned by the Bruces. And what the deeds to the land show is that it was Mrs. Bruce who owned this beachfront property that was snatched away from her and her husband. I mean, there every effort to burn them out during Jim Crow. property that was worth more than $85 million today. And very recently, that land was restored to her legacy, her heirs. And so it's a very interesting kind of arc, and I'll just end that opening on thinking about Mrs. Bruce and her legacy being able to be restored.
Thank y'all. Hopefully you can hear me. First, I wanted to remark over why black people aren't over slavery, because white people ain't over losing us as slaves. That's the bottom line. All of our racial politics around white supremacy is that they have been permanently pissed that we are not still enslaved. And yet they want us to remain in that subservient status. They did the insurrection on January 6th, not because white votes weren't counted, but because black votes were.
Well, Loretta, to your point, the Dobbs decision, which has made all the news and part of why we're all gathered here, which overturned Roe v. Wade and Planned Parenthood v. Casey, comes out of a Mississippi law. And to your point about the taste of slavery still being so sweet on the lips of the former Confederacy, the 13th Amendment in 1865 abolished slavery. Mississippi did not ratify the 13th Amendment until 2013. I think that tells us all we need to know about the presence of slavery living amongst us with something like that.
So that was going to get to my question. Thank you, Michele, because I've been asked that a lot about the Dobbs decision. And was I, as a black woman, disappointed in the Dobbs decision? And I had to say, black women have never been able to rely on the Supreme Court for our freedom. I don't know when that happy day happened, but I missed the memo. So what does it say about why you think a black woman should now expect more of the Supreme Court than it's ever been able to deliver to black people? And why does that white gaze think that the courts are going to deliver us our freedom and human rights when they've consistently failed to do so? Y'all, as law professors, explain this shit to me.
I'll start off and then turn to
people?
you, Dorothy. It's a deep question. It's a heavy question because we want to think of our institutions as legitimate. We want to think that, that there's something to the rule of law and that it will be followed. But we, of course, see the complicity over time of these institutions and the subordination of people of color, of indigenous people, of black and brown people, Asian people, so it's a great question. And it's something that I've been working on in the book that I'm working on now about the complicity of the court. The court has been complicit and legislatures have been complicit in the status of women. So let's talk about all women, right? The reality is we only have to turn to law to see where and why women have had to run the marathon with, heavy weights around their necks. It's because it was placed in law. I mean, laws that said your husbands could beat you and that would be okay and helped up by courts. Laws that said women could be raped by their husbands and that is okay. We've seen court decisions, Loretta, look, I've read and written about court decisions where a 10-year-old girl was raped in the 1700s and the judge said, but if she was married to one of them, it would not be a crime. Why would you introduce that into the case? If this girl who has been raped by all these men, if only she had been, married to one of them, that this would not, we wouldn't have to be dealing with these questions. And, when I think about it in other ways, in terms of other arcs towards freedom, which include who we can be, that women are now achieving a certain status in our colleges and universities are a result of not only their hard work, but the reasons why they were excluded was matters of law upheld by the court, right? It's the Supreme Court that upheld laws saying women couldn't become attorneys, right? And so I think about this in the context of people like, oh, well, if women were only brighter, if they were only smarter, if there were only all these different things. And what's missing there, and nobody's talking about it, is that it's actually been lawmakers themselves, judges themselves, who have time and time again failed women, and they've certainly failed women of color. So your skepticism, I think, is absolutely right. But I do think that people, sort of turn to the hope of our institutions for relief. The problem is that it's not, our institutions have not been steady. And so I'll quickly say this and then turn it over to my good friend Dorothy. If we think about Reconstruction, that was critically important. And if you read the writings of the abolitionists in Congress, they were holding it down. I mean, Charles Sumner was talking about a human rights agenda for Black people. This is explicitly what he was saying, right? He was beaten nearly to death in the halls of Congress 2 days after talking about the brutal rapes of Black women and girls, right? Trying to bring legitimacy to these institutions. And the 13th Amendment, 14th Amendment were radical. I mean, they really were. But to your point, Loretta, I mean, barely 20 years, not even 20 years after the abolition of slavery, the Supreme Court ruling in a case called the Civil Rights Cases, that it was time for Black people to become mere citizens and that they had been too favored in law. And you can't make that up. Not even 20 years after slavery, it's the Supreme Court saying, okay, you guys have been treated too well now. Now you just need to become normal. Or you think about the Civil Rights Act of 64, the Voting Rights Act of 65. Who's been dismantling it? It's this Supreme Court. The same Supreme Court that this year told Black women just go vote if you don't like Dobbs is the same Supreme Court that a few years ago dismantled key provisions of the Voting Rights Act. And so I think that what this represents is this kind of tension that we've always had to uphold these institutions and try to make them better, while at the same time certainly seeing these institutions as having failed us over and again. That is a hard question. Dorothy, I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, well, picking up on what Michele said, the US Supreme Court has been from the very beginning a supporter of white supremacy. And so slavery was written into the Constitution, or at least it was written into it, and it was also protected by the US Constitution, which the US Supreme Court upheld. And you can see in every instance where the court has adjusted to current politics, it's then changed its jurisprudence in order to preserve the interests of white people. Initially, soon after Reconstruction, it helped with the evisceration of the Reconstruction amendments and the upholding of white domination in the South, especially, but also around the nation. And it also then, when we get to, I'll fast forward to the civil rights movement, and there was, rebellion, political upheaval, the end of Jim Crow, it then changed its jurisprudence to still uphold white supremacy by adopting the notion of colorblindness, that any use of race, even to redress the long history of oppression of Black people, violated the Constitution. So it turned the Reconstruction amendments, which Michele just pointed out, were written to end slavery and to make Black people equal citizens. It turned that on its head to support the rights of white people to maintain power. I mean, it literally, that's how the court has interpreted the 14th Amendment, as an amendment that prohibits the use of race to redress white supremacy and supports the interests of white people. And we're probably going to see an affirmative action decision coming up in this term that eviscerates voting rights and affirmative action even more than it has in the past. Let me also point out, since we're talking about reproductive justice, that despite Roe versus Wade, which people are proclaiming as the savior of our human rights, that Roe versus Wade not only was a very limited decision, it never supported real reproductive justice, but immediately after Roe versus Wade, we see a whole series of US Supreme Court decisions that limit access to abortion. On top of, I want to throw out Buck versus Bell, which was a US Supreme Court decision by the revered Oliver Wendell Holmes that upheld eugenicist sterilization. But after Roe v. Wade was decided, the US Supreme Court had to decide, can the federal government, states ban funding for abortion services, even though they fund all other kinds of healthcare? So it's both a form of gender discrimination, but also a violation of reproductive justice to deny funding for this health service. And the court said that there was no right to funding for abortion services. And then the Casey decision that opened the floodgates to states being able to pass whatever laws they wanted, as long as it's an undue burden. And so you have this jurisprudence that states can do whatever they want practically to keep people from getting abortions. That was a decision that predates Dobbs. So, Loretta, you're right. Why would we have any faith in the Supreme Court protecting reproductive justice when it actually never has had a reproductive justice approach? And it has been affirmatively anti-abolition, and from the beginning interpreted the 13th and 14th Amendments in an anti-abolitionist way, in a way to uphold the rights of white people to dominate and to continue to inflict backlashes against the gains that Black people and other people of color are able to achieve through their resistance.
Wow. Thank you for that. It segues into our next question. But there's a crucial tension that we're reckoning with here. And on the one hand, that's the Black women's efforts to drive institutional accountability at the same time that we're reckoning with the reality that our protection is literally written out of law and reinforced through multiple different legislations and practices. So Dr. Robertson, Dr. Goodwin, you both described the policing and criminalization of Black mothers and have challenged the constitutionality of policies that treat Black women's childbearing and parenting as scapegoats, as opposed to the structural racism that causes their, premature deaths and exposure to white supremacy and other forms of domestic terrorism. And importantly, your work is illuminating these different forms of policing, right? But beyond just simply the policed in-person encounter, but really thinking about the broader policing, reproductive surveillance, right? Policing of wombs, of bodies, where coercion and control really is grounded in matters and happens in covert and overt ways across the reproductive life cycle, from, pregnancy to birth to child rearing to parenting, and through prosecution and shame. So just as policing isn't subject to only police encounters, reproductive rights, as you note, isn't exhausted by only abortion, but extend to these broader reproductive injustices. So the question is, how does this perspective really shape the way you engage with this work in practice? And Dorothy, Dr. Roberts, you begin talking about that in the way you're talking about moving towards these abolitionist futures and present, right? Because it doesn't have to be a far off abstract thing. No. There are concrete ways to do that. How do you engage with this perspective in concrete practice?
Yeah, so my very first work as a researcher, as a law professor, as an activist, was opposing the prosecutions of Black women who were pregnant and using drugs. And that put me into connection with Loretta Ross and other reproductive justice activists who recognized that punishing Black women's childbearing was just as compelling, just as oppressive a way that US society, including the federal and state governments, were attempting to control Black women and degrade us and violate our human rights, just as oppressive as efforts to keep us from terminating a pregnancy. And also the way in which criminalizing and policing were forms of gender and racial oppression, and also class oppression, because these policies tend to target impoverished communities as well, and usually the intersection of all of them. And so one impact it has on the way I've approached these issues is it makes it clear that there are as the Combahee River Collective said in the 1970s, these systems of oppression are interlocking, and so are the broad systems of oppression, like patriarchy and racial capitalism and white supremacy, but so are the institutions that implement those hierarchies. They're intersecting with each other. So with the prosecutions, for example, it turned the public health issue of substance use during pregnancy into a crime because of the devaluation of Black women's childbearing. The public was willing to see this transformation of something having to do with health into a crime. And similarly, the policing of families through child protective services and the so-called child welfare system, which is what I've been working on most intensively lately, takes something that should be supportive, the caring for children, and how to support families to be able to do that, and turns that into accusing family caregivers of harming their children and prosecuting them and tearing their families apart. Again, taking an approach that should be caring and supportive and turning it into a carceral approach. And so I think it's important to see how even institutions like education, healthcare, social services that are supposed to be supportive can be turned into crimes, either literal crimes or the equivalent of crimes, in the sense that they result in severe punishment. They give license to the state, to cops, whether they're caseworkers or police officers, to terrorize people and try to destroy their lives. And all of this serves the purpose of upholding the power of the most elite, who can then say, and this also goes to the question, Loretta, that you asked, why do people believe this? Because it's, believe in the court. It's a myth that these institutions are actually meeting people's needs, are actually solving social problems, are actually keeping us safe, when in fact they're not. They're doing the opposite. But this propaganda, the propped up ideology of benevolence and protection is so powerful. But it's powerful in every single case because Black women have been the targets, and because of this longstanding thinking that we are harmful to our children, that we produce children who are problems for society, that our fertility and childbearing itself, the autonomy over our bodies is a social problem. It allows this myth to go on that these institutions that are punitive are somehow solving our problems. And so that leads me then to an abolitionist stance, which is these systems are designed to be oppressive. They're designed to quelch resistance or squelch. I guess that's the word I wanted. Squelch
We
resistance.
can use quelch to quelch
Yeah,
things.
okay. Then to
It's a portmanteau. We got
pretend
it.
to quench the thirst for liberation. I'll put it that way. Let me save my metaphor. Um, and uh, that's how they function to to be an opposition to resistance. And therefore, the only way to truly find liberation is to build an abolitionist movement, which Jallicia, just add, as you said, is not something pie in the sky in the future. It's something we're building right now as we dismantle these oppressive institutions and at the very same time replace them with ways that truly care for people, truly meet human needs and children's needs and families' needs, are truly supportive. And as we build those, we are building the replacement for these punitive carceral systems that have targeted Black women for so long, and other marginalized people for so long, and in the end, building a more caring, humane society that values our human rights.
So I'll pick up from there and say that I'm a researcher. So as a researcher who's also, and my it would happen that I'm speaking and my doorbell rings. I will continue to talk despite the bell ringing. But let me say that as a researcher, this has meant wanting to bear witness in the way in which researchers do. That is, to research, to write about, to expose what is happening within a society that would otherwise frame women of color, Black women, as being people who are inaccurate, people who are making things up. So there is something really important to actually lay the foundation and to bring what young people call the receipts. And that is critically important. It's not just theory, but that we are actually able to show our archive, right? And imagine if we're not able to. That is the fight right now against history in schools. People don't want the receipts, right? Like they don't want to hear it. And imagine if you don't hear it, then it is as if saying it doesn't exist, that it is not there, which is why it is so important to archive exactly what we have experienced in these lands, such that we can figure out, ways forward. So within that context, what's been concrete has been my field research, and that field research has included not just the academic side and doing it domestically, spending real time in Alabama, interviewing prosecutors more than a decade ago. It's been interesting very recently being interviewed by an international news platform that wanted some video of me, some what they call B-reel, to add to their reel. And coming across a 2012-13 clip where I was saying the things that we're saying today, right? So to Loretta's point about the court, right? Like some of us knew and were saying that it's coming, right? And this is also the important part about bringing the receipts, doing the work. There it is. We've been saying it. And, and I think about that within the context of something like Birth of a Nation, because Dorothy, to your point about the framing of Black children as being problematic, Black women as problematic, Black men as problematic, that's part of a Jim Crow story. So you think about the sort of Jim Crow stories like, Black women are just lazy. Were they so lazy during slavery? I mean, if they were lazy during slavery, you wouldn't have been using them, right? But that's a very helpful Jim Crow story, right? I mean, because it helps to reframe everything, right? The story of the oversexed Black man who's just waiting to pounce on a white woman. Well, that's a very helpful Jim Crow narrative to reshape things. And you won't find, as you canvass the archives of American slavery, you do not find diaries. And for various works that I do, I read old diaries, cases, all of that. But you're not finding these cases of like, the plantations had to shut down because Black men were just raping all the white women. That didn't exist. That's like the narrative of Jim Crow to help explain, or justify slavery, in the back lens. So, what's been more, I'm so happy that, Professor Roberts here has been a great teammate of mine. So, I wanted Amnesty International to respond to this as an international crisis. And launched, and Professor Roberts joined the first team at Amnesty to focus on these issues in a 2-year task force that we set up to pay attention to what was happening to girls and women being prosecuted for issues related to their pregnancies. Joining boards of small organizations like Gina's team in Arizona, an organization that worked on behalf of incarcerated women, because that was important. Spending time in Alabama, embedding myself so that I could interview the Alabama prosecutors who were prosecuting women and tossing them in jail for issues related to their pregnancies. And perhaps what I'll close off on that, and there's so much more that I could share in terms of that work and building the archive, including my work at the ACLU on its executive committee. But I will say this. My work with Gina's team was really quite impactful. Gina's team was named after a young woman who was incarcerated who had been denied medical services, and she was 25 years old. And when she complained of how difficult it was to eat, she said it was like having knives stabbed into her jaw, the headaches that were severe. And she was in an Arizona jail, mother of 4, and she was denied medical services. On the day in which she finally was given a thermometer, she lapsed into a coma and died 3 days later. Well, it was her cellmate who I first came to know, Sue Ellen, who has since passed away. Sue Ellen had breast cancer in jail, and she described how she was kept in a holding cell with rats and roaches before she was took to a place where she was shackled and chained, while she described her breast being chopped off with nobody there to support her. And she wrote, how I came to know Sue Ellen is her writing about how it was the women behind bars, mostly Black and brown, who came to her aid, who kept her alive in her recovery from breast cancer, giving her the things that the prison was denying her. Well, I tell this story because it kind of comes full circle. One day I was giving a talk. I had just landed in Boston. I was due to give a talk the next day at Northeastern. And it was about 2 in the morning, and I got a call from Sue Ellen, and she was crying and she was apologizing for calling me so late. And I said, Sue Ellen, don't worry about it. And she said, well, Michele, I'm calling to tell you that Gina's oldest child shot herself in the head tonight. And the point being is that these patterns of incarceration and the invisibility of women, and that they have children, and all of these things link to matters that we don't talk about, and the harms and pain that we don't talk about, and how Gina's daughter, 19 years old, I think she was, killing herself because these are the sort of way in which we govern people's bodies, their lives, etc., have great effects on all of us.
If I could just make a brief comment about that, Michele, because it reminds me of how the family policing system operates so brutally against Black families. Half of Black children are going to experience child welfare, so-called child welfare investigation by the time they reach age 18. And I think it operates this way largely because of these myths that Black women don't care about their children, that we don't really have loving relationships with our children. And so it's better off to take the children away. They don't suffer the traumas that you just mentioned. And I too have met people whose children have committed suicide or experienced other kinds of traumas. We know that the suicide rate among children who've experienced foster care is extremely high. And we know that those traumas happen to us as well, but there is this idea that it's not a big deal to take children away from
There's the
Black
pornography
families.
of pain, Dorothy, right? I mean,
Yeah,
there's this sense
yeah.
that the addiction to Black pain as being the narrative that undergirds, sadly, so much of Americana. And we can't deny it, right? When you think about Hilton Al's book, Without Sanctuary, and Without Sanctuary was the compendium of all of these postcards of people at lynchings, right? It wasn't like these are people smiling underneath the charred, lynched bodies of Black women, Black men, Black children. You know, something very deep and visceral that we can still feel viscerally, the chill of somehow people being gleeful about Black pain. It's a stunning thing.
Well, that reminds me of how there's lots of evidence that doctors routinely deny pain medication to Black people, and research has recently shown that doctors, white doctors, believe these myths that Black people have thicker skin, less sensitive nerve endings, and just don't experience pain as much. So we see this in healthcare as well, which I am sure, and there's some research showing this as well, that contributes to the high rate of Black maternal deaths in this nation. But let me just finish my thought, and then I'll turn it back over to Jallicia and Loretta, which is, despite this idea that we don't feel pain, and that in particular, Black families don't feel pain from separation, the reason why the family policing system targets Black families is partly to terrorize us. In other words, they know that this causes harm to our families. And yet there's this contradiction that they're able to do it because of the myth that it doesn't actually cause us harm. And so these myths are so internally contradictory. Like the myth you said, Black women are lazy, and yet we have been hired to clean homes and wash clothes and take care of children, for hundreds of years, or forced to do it, hired more recently, prior to that, forced to do it in chains. And it just emphasizes, I think, how racism can turn what is absolutely absurd into something that seems logical, under white supremacy. But if you examine it, and if you experience it, you know immediately that it is a made up absurdity that is, though powerful, to help perpetuate these systems that we are resisting.
I had a professor at Emory University named Deborah Lifstadt, who, of course, is an expert in the Holocaust denial movement. And one of the points she used to teach, still does, is that if you de-victimize the victims, then you don't have to be accountable for what you've done to them. Okay? And so I see this effort in the maintenance of white supremacy in the effort to de-victimize what happened to indigenous people, to Black people, to immigrants, because then if you deny the crime, you can deny the accountability. How is our system trying to de-victimize the people it's chewing up in the jaws of white supremacy?
I think it's an excellent question. One of the things that we don't pay as much attention to is the ways in which there have been the narratives, these powerful narratives about the disfavored communities that are here. Disfavored or original people, indigenous people, right? The stereotypes and the stigmas about them, right? That, of course, this nation should be owned by people who stole it from indigenous people, because indigenous people were air quote savage, right? You know, these narratives, and the same, we know the sort of bucket full of ones about Black people, but there are ones about Asian people too. A lot of people don't know that Asian folks couldn't even naturalize in the United States until the mid part of the last century. The Page Act stereotyped, I mean, the legislative history about that, denying Asian women citizenship and entry on the notion that was being debated is that they're sex workers, they're prostitutes. This is why we can't, I mean, it's just littered in sort of American culture and society have been these kind of stereotypes and stigmas that on one hand demonize people that we could call the other, and then on the other hand elevate and forgive the crimes of others, right? It's an interesting thing to sort of think about in the wake of 2016, after the tapes came to light of the former president talking about how he sexually assaults women. And the way in which the media representation afterwards was that that's just locker room talk, or the way in which when we see that a Black child who is handcuffed at school at 5 or 6 years old is described like an adult. And then meanwhile, you hear cases involving white men who've committed crimes on tape being called, you know, young man, right? And it's just sort of this interesting way in which we do this. And the erasure, you know, so Professor Roberts talked about Buck v. Bell. You know, 1927, it's our United States Supreme Court that sanctions eugenics that then Germany borrows from. We wipe it away as if we were never there. We wipe it away as if we never had the fitter family contest, which we did, right? We wipe away the narrative that we gave badges and awards to white families that had blonde hair and blue eyes because we saw them as the fittest. And what those narratives also mean is that they've contributed to a certain brand of white supremacy that fails to explore the white supremacy within whiteness. The fact that at the turn of the 20th century, there were over 30 categories of whiteness. And if you were at the bottom of the scales in that whiteness, this was a country that was literally trying to get rid of you. That, you know, in Buck v. Bell, an 8-1 decision where the Supreme Court explicitly says this is a case that's about a white girl who had been raped when she was 16 years old and had a pregnancy out of wedlock and a birth. And the court says, better than to let them starve for their imbecility, society can prevent those who are manifestly unfit from continuing their kind. Poor white people, manifestly unfit. And then Germany takes that up, right? And so again, you know, the sort of narratives that we keep and the ones that we sort of dispense with is something for us to pay close attention to.
Yeah, picking up on that rationalization for eugenic sterilization that Oliver Wendell Holmes laid out in Buck v. Bell, what he did is, in that quote you mentioned, was say it's actually good for unfit people to be sterilized because we're saving them from starvation that we know is going to happen because of their mental incapacity to be able to survive in society. And so I think that's such a good example of the kind of ideological gymnastics that white supremacy and ableism and patriarchy do by pointing to people who are oppressed as being naturally inferior, and therefore the oppression, the violence against them is seen as something that's good for them. So it's not only, you know, as Loretta, you're saying, de-victimizing, it's not leaving the victims of oppression in a neutral state. It's saying we're actually inflicting violence that's good for you. It's, you know, it's even worse than saying you're not a victim. Saying this is good for you. And that's, you know, Samuel Cartwright was a doctor in the 1850s who trained at my university, University of Pennsylvania, the first medical school and hospital in the nation. And he developed this theory that Black people naturally have lower lung capacity, and therefore they have to be forced to work to be healthy. And so he turned the oppression of Black people through enslavement into a form of freedom for Black people by saying they were naturally inferior, therefore being forced to work was good for them. Slavery was good for their health. And this is such a common way that white supremacy turns oppression into benefit for Black people. Again, the family policing system is a perfect example of that because it goes around terrorizing Black families in the name of saving Black children from their dangerous parents. And the people who do that can tell themselves, we are actually helping Black children. We're saving them, especially if we can get them adopted into white families, which, by the way, is the Dobbs, what Dobbs says as well. We're saving these children to be adopted by better parents, people who will actually care for them. That's why you see these signs that say, I will adopt your children by the anti-abortion protesters. And reminds me, I'm glad that I have an opportunity to bring this in because we got to mention Clarence Thomas's idea that by the Dobbs decision, by denying access to abortion, by banning abortions, you are saving Black children. Of course, through the mechanism of Black women are inflicting genocide against their own communities. And the poster that went up that said the most dangerous place for an African American is in the womb, perpetuating this myth that Black women's wombs are dangerous for their children, which is a eugenicist, right, idea, but now in the name of denying reproductive justice, but turning it into we're saving Black children. Again, not only erasing the victimization of people who are denied reproductive autonomy and rights, but making it seem as if this is a benefit for Black communities.
I just wanted to follow up because we've talked about the racialization of reproductive politics. I have somewhat controversially stated that the banning of abortion and birth control and sex education is a scheme designed to compel white women to have more babies. It is the forced breeding of white women.
Mm-hmm.
There's nothing they've ever done that convinced me that they want more brown and Black babies.
Oh, yeah.
What do you
Well,
think about
there's actually
their
record of
failure
that.
to see that?
Well, there's record of that, right? So the early anti-abortion laws were directly connected to seeing the Civil War on the horizon. And so Horatio Storer, Joseph Dooley, these are sort of leading men of medicine that used the AMA as a platform for one, getting rid of midwives, but two, leading anti-abortion campaigns. And they explicitly wrote that white women were needed to use their loins and to go north, south, east, and west, right? So the very people who are saying we need anti-abortion laws are the people who are writing we need white women to use their loins. And it's very clear, right? Like that the two end up being connected. And you see it today in this kind of notion of replacement theory, right? This sort of, articulation that there's the browning of the United States. And so there's the need again for white women to use their loins and to preserve a power base that's not for white women adjacent. And we can unpack that at another talk. But this is about, let's exploit white women and their uteruses to preserve the power of white male elites. And again, this is not like hyperbole. Oh, we just got these, folks up here making things up. These are the written records that these people left behind for us to read, right? Like we're just reading their own words into the record.
Yeah, absolutely. There is lots of historical evidence that anti-abortion advocacy and movements and laws are directed at increasing the white population. And as Michele said, forcing white women to give birth. I hope I indicated that in pointing out that even though Clarence Thomas and others are exploiting a false narrative about eugenics in order to promote abortion bans, using Black women and the allegation, the accusation, the shaming of genocide as a ploy. That's the language that they're using, that our wombs are dangerous, that's the same language that supports sterilizing Black women and denying Black women freedom to have children. So there's no, sometimes people say, well, that seems so contradictory. Well, it's the thinking is contradictory. It's internally contradictory, but it's not contradictory in terms of the policies and laws that come out of it, because what comes out of it is pressuring Black people and others whose childbearing is devalued to be sterilized and to not take the risk of getting pregnant. The same people who support abortion bans, many of them also support coercive sterilization of people they don't think should be having children. So there's nothing contradictory about forcing white women to have more babies at the same time that you apply policies and laws and other tactics to force or coerce Black women and other marginalized people to be sterilized.
Wow. Thank you for that. I want to be mindful of time, but I also still want to bask in the brilliance and imagination that is this Black feminist lawyering for reproductive justice. If you have a book on that, I will read and assign. Please let me know. One of the questions I want to wrap up with is, how can law be marshaled to protect marginalized communities, particularly Black women, Indigenous women, women of color, particularly in the face of these oppressive systems, right, from police to prisons to not so much healthcare, but the violence of it, child welfare systems, as you poignantly described, in terms of thinking about the foster industrial complex and the system of family policing. How can we marshal law in these really productive, imaginative ways that are aligned with the futures that preserve life? And if you can outline any strategies that we can use to really serve locally based organizing and national advocacy to make these better connections between law, mobilization, and advocacy, love to hear that as well.
So maybe I'll start really quickly and just say that I believe that there's a need for a third Reconstruction. And if the first one was a matter of abolishing slavery, expanding citizenship, equal opportunity, voting rights, we of course saw that defeated by the Supreme Court. And if the second one was 100 years later, quite literally, with the 64 Voting Rights Act, 64 Civil Rights Act, and then the Voting Rights Act, again squandered and defeated, I think the real question is, if we use law as a tool, if there is a third Reconstruction, and I hope for it, then I think about centering the lives of women and girls, centering LGBTQ communities, individuals with disabilities. And my biggest concern is how we hold on to it. You know, I think about part of the failure of the second Reconstruction was how people like Jesse Helms were tolerated, Strom Thurmond tolerated in our Senate. People who were self-defined misogynist, who spoke in very sexist and homophobic kinds of ways, who were tolerated as that's just old Uncle Jesse, when in reality, these were people who held power seats, seats that could help defeat exactly the civil rights platforms that had been so hard fought for. So I do think that there is something to the arc of justice. I do think we'll reach it. But my biggest concern is that once we do, how do we hold on to it in a way that is firmer than the grip that we saw so shortly after slavery, where the Supreme Court said, well, okay, it's been enough time that you've had these, less than 20 years back as you were, essentially.
Yes, W.E.B. Du Bois wrote about the failure of the first Reconstruction to actually institute a democracy in America and pointed out that ending chattel slavery, giving Black people on paper citizenship rights doesn't achieve that vision if there is no democracy or other systems of and institutions and ways of thinking that actually can support the equal freedom and rights of all people in the nation. And that's part of the thinking behind current abolitionist movements, that it's not enough to pass laws to protect rights if we don't have a more deeper foundation for a completely different approach to people's human needs and social problems and conflicts in this nation and in our communities. And so abolition, I mentioned it a little bit before, but just to put I'll just put some meat on the bones, in particular having to do with abolishing family policing. We can use the law to rescind laws that exist now that support these institutions, like ending the Adoption and Safe Families Act that speeds up termination of parental rights and incentivizes adoption over returning children home. We can also pass laws, and there are efforts going on now. I'll point to JMAC for Families in New York City that has a legislative plan that's implementing this, are trying to anyway, advocating for it. Laws that support the constitutional right to a warrant before someone comes and searches your home, giving people more power to disempower these oppressive institutions. And then at the same time, we can think of how we can use the law to seek redress, reparations. Chicago was able to do that, seeking redress against the police department that had tortured Black people, defendants in that city, and figure out how we can use the law as well to support community-based resources for people instead of relying on these punitive systems. It takes a lot of strategy. Can we make legal reforms that are abolitionist, and how do we distinguish them from laws that only reform and just legitimize even more these oppressive institutions? And those are the kinds of deep conversations that we need to continue having in order to have build a society that is truly caring and humane and equal and democratic.
Thank you so much, Dr. Roberts and Dr. Goodwin. We do want to make some time to open it up for questions. Do we have time?
Well, audience questions. But the audience the audience is
I only have a little time because I have to
Exactly. We both actually have to leave at the time of the program.
so y'all gotta go.
Unfortunately, I apologize. I have to leave in 5 minutes. I'm so sorry.
We overstand. Okay. So, do we have time for like one or two?
Yes, go ahead, ask your question.
Yeah, go ahead.
I don't know. I mean, as Michele said, she has to leave in 5 minutes. So do I. I have to get to another in-person program.
We overstand, so we'll get in one question and then we'll go.
Okay, can anyone hear me? I don't know how to articulate this, but I'm coming to the conclusion that the reason why Roe v. Wade was overturned is that there's a changing demographic in our country, and the people in power don't want that to exist. So they're clearly having, they're trying to have it so there's an increase of procreation among white women. And I'm wondering, I feel as if I have so limited control over the situation, and there's nothing I really can do that can be assistable, but how can I proactively engage myself besides educating others.
Did you hear the question?
Yeah. So, my quick answer to that, since we don't have a lot of time, is find an organization of people who are organizing to find other ways of supporting reproductive justice than relying on the US Supreme Court and relying on decisions like Roe v. Wade. We've been talking about reproductive justice. There are reproductive justice organizations. One would be to start with Sister Song. They have lots of information on their website. You can donate to abortion funds to provide services. The abortion funds are not only giving money to people for abortions, but also strategizing about how to deal with the state that we're in now. But overall, you join with people who have your mission to support reproductive justice. Those organizations exist, and you can find them. Start with Sister Song and all the information it has on its website.
All right. Well, we want to thank Dorothy and Michele, first of all. Who have to run. So thank y'all.
And we want to thank Dr. Ross. Loretta, congratulations.
Yay!
All right, thank
So
y'all.
thank you both for
the
moderating
movement.
this program. It
But
was
I
my
also
pleasure
was
to
gonna
be
say
here
that I
and
just
my
checked-
honor. So thank you.
Thank you. I was also gonna say, because Michele and Dorothy do have to run, Jallicia and I have decided that we would stay till 6:30 to continue the Q&A for the audience, okay?
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, now the audience will have the benefit of these two brilliant people. So thanks so much for that. And
Thank
it was
y'all.
wonderful to engage with you. Thanks for inviting us.
All right. Power.
Bye. Bye-bye.
Yes.
What did I post on my Twitter?
Well, let's bring it up.
I wanted to speak to your question while she does that.
So
though.
it's up already. So I'm so honored to be one of the MacArthur Fellows of 2022. When you serve your people with integrity, all your dreams come true, and you get your flowers while you're alive. This goes beyond my dreams.
I'm getting my flowers. Now I don't need to keel over. But I really wanted to speak to this whole dilemma about the role of white women in protesting white supremacy. Because there's this mistaken impression that the role of white people is to come to the assistance of people of color. That could be helpful, but it could also be even more problematic. Because right now, America is not divided. White people are divided. Okay? And so if you want to challenge the great white replacement theory, you're not going to challenge that in communities of color. You're going to challenge that in white communities. Right? Because we ain't the ones pushing the damn theory. Okay? And the problem that I see in a lot of our work is that there's no separation between white supremacy as an ideology and whiteness as an identity. Because obviously everybody white is not a white supremacist, and unfortunately every white supremacist ain't white. Okay? Because it's an ideological commitment to a body of ideas. And so if one wants to fight this resurgence of fascism that is manifesting itself into an attack on abortion and birth control and stuff, the side of that struggle is in the white community. That's where it's being fought out, okay? And so, but don't get it wrong. When we say go talk to your people, we don't mean go talk down to your people, because all you're doing is making it harder for us. When you don't know, if you ain't talking to your grandfather except at Thanksgiving when you turn over the damn table, you ain't helping us out. You know, you have relationships with these people that you need to be talking to every day about this shit, instead of trying to bring your problem, your inability to talk about these issues to our human rights movement like we're going to serve as your personal therapy space. That needs to be said. You know, for real. You know? Yeah. And there are so many resources available. There's Surge, there's other groups that can help people do this. But if white women do not understand their role as the forced breeders and maintenance of white supremacy, we're gonna have to move on over you. Because we cannot keep standing aside thinking that we have the time for you to grow the fuck up. That's as bluntly as I can put it. I'm sorry, somebody's passing a mic around. There they are. Y'all
Hello?
notice I can't keep it clean for long. I'm a delight in the classrooms. You know?
Thanks for saying
Can you hear me? Okay. I was wondering, first of all, thank you so much for being here again. It's truly incredible. I was wondering if you had any thoughts on the an issue that's kind of like, it's definitely tied in with reproductive justice, which is the fertility industry, as well as the like adoption industry, and how issues of white supremacy and ableism and also heteronormativity factor into that. And I was wondering if in any of your work you've seen, I know a lot of children who are, you know, adopted or donor conceived have issues where the fertility industry is very centralized around parents, and while that is important, the children so often get neglected. I was wondering if you had any thoughts on how that ties into the reproductive justice movement.
You want to do it? You want to do it? But I'll get to this one. My more recent scholarship has been on a concept that I call reproductive futurism. And I'm calling it that because we have to use the reproductive justice analysis and framework to challenge this whole techno-utopia bullshit that's being run on us about the management and the profitability of reproduction and the commodification of people's bodies that includes racism, ableism, heteropatriarchy, and all of that crap. I believe that if we don't have a conversation about techno-utopianism, that technology will simply upgrade present inequalities without addressing them. Because nobody sane imagines the future designer babies will not be white. Okay? Nobody's trying to design new black babies, kind of thing. And so, yes, we need to have that conversation, but one of the problems we're encountering is that we're so stymied in the debate over abortion that we can't even get to the conversations around the commodification of white women's wombs, the adoption industry, the egg harvesting that is hurting people's bodies and overpromising babies that can't even be born. I mean, hell, only 13% of the eggs harvested even result in successful pregnancy. They don't tell nobody there's an 87% failure rate as they charge you $20,000 per time, kind of stuff. So we need to talk about all of that. And that's why reproductive justice strives to go beyond the paralysis of the pro-choice, pro-life debate and look at these larger questions of how they're busily redefining who the hell is even a human being. You know, and yet we're not part of those conversations in a way that is driven by the values of human rights.
Mm-hmm.
Sure, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm wondering how you see the recent bans on healthcare for trans kids playing into this issue of reproductive justice and bodily autonomy, and really, what do you see the neo-fascist strategy of defending a gender binary being? What is their long game, and what is our duty in expanding our concepts of gender as a resistance practice?
Well, I don't know why I'm jumping into it. I'm the one keynoting the Harry Potter conference next week. Talk about stepping into shit without hip waders. Hey, I get asked to do real fun stuff, right? I'm about to get into real trouble here, so that doesn't scare me. I think there is a wonderful expansion of the gender continuum. I love it. Because the absolutism of white supremacy is so much a part of necropolitics. It's so much a part of what's killing people. It is manifesting and justifying the disposability of bodies. Having said that, I also think there is a different kind of danger from gender neutrality. Because gender neutrality works in a white supremacist system the same way that color blindness works. It de-victimizes the victims. And so we're going to have some really careful conversations about that shit before we end up subscribing to our own oppression, thinking we're doing something liberatory. The same way people think that by saying, I don't see race, they are doing something liberatory. And so that's why I'm deeply concerned that we can't have this conversation without people jumping down each other's damn throats, calling each other out, calling each other, simply because we need to have some damn difficult conversations. That's my opinion on gender inclusivity. But I can say one other thing. I don't care what you call yourself, but I can tell you one thing. Ain't nobody ever needed an abortion who wasn't pregnant first. You can't get around the plumbing. And that's something people don't necessarily want to acknowledge, but you really can't get around the plumbing. Okay, let me shut up.
And the last thing I'll add is I think one intention that I lead with when I'm organizing, researching, and working with people in community with people is figuring out how we can be intersectional, more conversant with each other's agendas, interests, and movements. Yes.
Mm-hmm. That's one reason I'm so much an advocate of the call out of calling in the call out culture, because I believe we're holding a winning hand. Because the people opposed to our human rights think they're fighting us, but they're wrong. They're fighting truth. They're fighting time. They're fighting evidence, and they're fighting history. And any one of those things, truth, time, evidence, and history, could kick their asses, even if we didn't do nothing. But my fear is that our indulgence, our self-indulgence in the call-out culture means that we don't take advantage of the fact that truth, evidence, time, and history is on our side, because we're going to call each other out so much that we cannibalize each other on the pathway to victory. And that is the risk of losing that I'm afraid of.
Thank you so much. I don't have a question, but I wanted to say something as we talked about women of color. I'm a woman of color myself. I'm from Afghanistan, a country where a genocide and also gender apartheid is going on. Last 3 weeks ago, there was a suicide attack among teenagers where 53 of them died and 115 were killed. It is from my ethnic group, Hazaras. We have been subjected to genocide over 100 years, and nobody talks about it. It started 100 years ago and is still going on. On the other hand, when the US government signed a deal with the Taliban, brought back terrorists to power, first thing that they did was to not let girls above age 12 to go to school. Women are not allowed to go outside. They have to cover head to toe. Women without men are not allowed to travel by themselves. Last week, 3 weeks ago, when the explosion went off, women took it on the street. They were protesting when they faced the Taliban. Many of them were arrested. And then we don't know what happened to these people. And then I want to ask you one thing. Just go on Twitter and search Stop Hazara Genocide. You see a lot of things. You see so many photos that you might not be able to look at it because teenage girls are covered in blood just because they are Hazaras and also just because they wanted to go to school and they wanted to just get education. These are girls with simple dreams. There is a girl that her family found her diary after she was killed. She wrote in her diary that I want to be able to walk in a park at night and just write my own novel. She was just 17. And then today we're here, I'm here, and I'm talking about women's rights. I'm listening to you, and I'm thinking about these 53 young girls that their bodies were mangled. Some families even couldn't find their bodies to put them in a graveyard. So one thing that I'm asking you is to just hold American politicians accountable from your side, because I have no power. Americans came to our country, fought for 20 years, and all of a sudden they were tired of us, and they were tired of the bloodshed in our country, and they brought the terrorists back to power. And right now, it is just one single group, just from one ethnic group, that they control the entire country, and then even journalists don't get to cover it. And also 23 lives, and it was just a news story, maybe 500 words, maybe 600 words, or maybe 400 words. And nobody just followed up with their families and asked them how they are doing. It has been happening for 100 years. And I think it's enough. And then I think, apart from us asking for justice, asking for help, I think the international community and everybody has to wake up and stand with us. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for that.
I guess I just... Hi, okay. So I'm just trying to wrap my brain around trying to understand how to work this in. But when I look back in history in Canada, I think of the filles du roi, who were imported from France, the white French woman who were imported from France, very young or from broken homes, who got sent from France over to Canada to make more babies. And so now it feels like there's this repeat of history that was so acceptable at that time. And so it's more a statement than anything, but a lot of this did come to my mind. So thank you very much for being here.
Sorry. Thank you for that. I'll give that last question to Loretta, but I did want to thank the previous speaker and also recognize what was brought in the space. And take a moment to sit with that heavy weight that we should share and distribute. And it reminds me of the ways in which, when we think about human rights and our social movements, who is centered, who is prioritized, there's an American exceptionalism that absolutely is threaded throughout the way many movements organize, right? And I think when I talk about this often with a colleague, Dr. Favorite Irakunda, when we're making connections, it's important to really think transnationally and to really think about these embodied and state impacts of sort of colonialism, of imperialism, and of these various forms of state violence. And I think about what you described. I often hold that when I also think about the genocide in Rwanda. I think about the humanitarian exploitation of Haiti, and I think about even Jamaica when the extradition happened and the U.S. went in and supported the military to murder poor Jamaicans. And so I think about these connections across spaces because central to the reproductive justice framework is a human rights framework, but also it's a recognition that there are lives that are never prioritized and never recognized, and thus pain that will never be responded to and continue to be distributed in a way that is and circulated in a trauma porn kind of way. And so thank you for bringing that into the space, and thank you for educating me about that and many of the people in this room, and I'm looking forward to hopefully connecting and following up.
I wanted to speak about the French women imported to Canada, because if you follow the arc of that story, you actually find that under a system of racialized capitalism, even a white identity is no protection. Because if you look at the eugenics records of Vermont, the people they sought to sterilize in the eugenics movement in Vermont were French Canadians, because they wanted their land, who we would all read as white. They had a eugenics office up in Shutesbury, Massachusetts, just above Amherst. Yeah. Yeah. Targeting white people in New England, because they were off-white, okay? And so that's why primitive identity politics really don't work when you're looking at racialized capitalism, and who is designated for disposability shifts based on the preferences and the needs of the elites, not the identities of the victims, kind of thing. I really want us to sophisticate our analyses around this stuff. You know, it was no accident that Carrie Buck was the one teed up to be the Supreme Court case. They searched and searched till they found a Carrie Buck to tee her up, kind of thing. And so, but again, I say, if you don't understand white supremacy in America, everything else about this country will confuse you.
Mm-hmm.
I think we're at the end of the time. Maybe we get one more comment in, one more question.
Is there any student who has a question? I just want to throw that out there.
There's a couple of on that row right there, I guess.
How do I choose now?
Just do both of them quickly.
Okay, both of them real quick.
Hi, thank you guys so much for being here and speaking to us. I'm just wondering if either of you can speak to like the additional barriers that exist for reproductive justice in the context of mass incarceration and the dehumanization of incarcerated people, such as like shackling during labor.
Okay, let's get the last question in so we can do both at the same time.
They just went.
Yeah, so my question was about like stories, and it seems to me like a lot of this stuff is like stories. It's deeply ingrained. So I guess my question is, how can we like really take a look at these stories and deconstruct them, and maybe, I don't know, in a way that can change our language or something like that? It's my general question.
There's been a lot of recent scholarship over the reproductive oppression of people who are incarcerated, not only trans people, but pregnant and parenting people who are incarcerated. I know the University of California Press is issuing several books on that. I have a lot of work in my anthology on radical reproductive justice about the violations. But what's more important, I'm not necessarily seeking more stories of what happens to women and people who are incarcerated. I want more stories of the resistance, because never do the people who are incarcerated just remain passive victims. To even describe them as passive victims dehumanizes them and denies them agency. So as I want to see more and more scholarship on the topic, I want to see scholarship of the resistance, not just what happened to them. Yes, you want to talk about storytelling?
So your question is really what is the significance of stories? How do we deconstruct them and kind of use them for movement building and expansion? Okay. And can you tell me what made you think? How did you come to that question? What made you think of it?
I don't know. I think a lot about language and story. It seems like I don't know. It's
Yeah.
I like film, and it just seems like
Yeah.
part of a lot of stuff.
No, I hear you. I think that's an important question, and I think storytelling is such a fascinating tool of this movement, particularly because one of the white supremacist tactic is to ignore people's stories, is to act like they don't exist, is to deprioritize the needs, interests, and experiences and lived realities of people that are often centered in these kinds of reproductive justice movements. And so I think storytelling is critical, it's impactful, it's empowering. It allows us to revise the really misrepresentations and straight out lies in history. And I think it's important intergenerationally too. The stories I heard from Loretta when I was 19 became the stories I remembered when I did my research, became the stories that I remembered when I made connections transnationally between Black women across the diaspora, became the stories that we were sharing, that we heard today, and they become really the knowledge production that is needed in order to really combat the invasion in our lives and our bodies, right, and on our communities. So I absolutely agree that storytelling is central, it's critical, it's impactful, and storytelling has to also be paired with advocacy, with political organizing, with grassroots mobilization, with that institutional change, with students putting pressures on their higher education institutions to make change, and to this intergenerational dynamic organizing work, and to also healing work.
All right. Well, thank y'all for coming out. Margaret, did you want to close us out?
Thank you both so much. And now there's a dance party at the Kern, to which you're all invited.
Whoa,
Oh,
You're good.